I found 40 party invitations circulating through a group chat screenshot a neighbor forwarded me, every single one advertising a graduation pool party at an address that was, unmistakably, my own house. And I want to be honest that the moment I confirmed neither my wife nor I had ever agreed to host any such thing, I already knew exactly what I was going to do about it. My name is Roland Thistlethwaite. I'm 46 years old, and my wife Petra and I have lived inside a community called Brookline Estates for almost 8 years. On a property with an in-ground pool we installed ourselves about 5 years ago, a genuinely substantial investment, running close to $60,000 once every feature was finished, that we'd always kept carefully maintained and had, over the years, occasionally opened up to close friends and a handful of neighbors for small, specifically invited gatherings. Always with our direct, advance permission required, and always, notably, with us personally present and involved in supervising whatever gathering was actually happening on our own property. I want to explain why that supervision detail matters, because it became relevant later in ways I didn't fully anticipate at the time. We'd always treated our pool as a genuine amenity we were happy to share selectively, but never as something we'd hand over entirely unsupervised, a distinction that felt obvious to Petra and me, but that, as this entire situation unfolded, apparently hadn't registered at all with our next-door neighbor. Our next-door neighbor, a woman named Deneen Coswell, had a son named Tyler who'd grown up next door to us over those same 8 years. A kid Petra and I had watched go from a toddler splashing in a kiddie pool to a high school senior about to graduate. And I want to say honestly that our relationship with both Deneen and Tyler had been perfectly cordial for most of that time, the ordinary, unremarkable kind of neighborly familiarity you build up over the better part of a decade living next door to the same family. That relationship shifted considerably about 6 weeks before Tyler's graduation, when Deneen approached Petra directly, mentioning that Tyler and his friends had been talking about hosting his graduation celebration at the pool, a phrasing that, according to Petra's own account of that conversation, she'd assumed at the time referred generally to some public pool or another friend's house entirely, given that nothing about the conversation involved any actual request to use our specific pool. And given that Deneen never once, in that exchange or any that followed over the next several weeks, formally asked either of us for permission to host anything at our property. I want to explain how we actually discovered what Deneen and Tyler had genuinely been planning, because it wasn't through any direct conversation at all. A neighbor a few houses down, a woman I knew casually through the HOA's occasional social events, forwarded Petra a screenshot from a group chat her own daughter had been added to, a chat where Tyler and several of his friends had been coordinating final details for what the invitation graphic explicitly described as a graduation pool party, complete with our actual street address printed directly on the invitation, a start time, and an estimated headcount that, based on the RSVPs already visible in that same screenshot, was approaching 40 guests. I want to describe reading through that screenshot for the first time, because it wasn't just the address and headcount that struck Petra and me as alarming. Further down in that same chat, several of Tyler's friends had apparently asked directly whether alcohol would be available, questions Tyler had answered, according to the messages visible in the screenshot, with a non-committal response suggesting some guests planned to bring their own regardless, a detail that, once we saw it, transformed this from simply an unauthorized use of our property into a situation carrying real potential liability. Given that hosting even an unknowing gathering where underage drinking occurred on our own premises could expose us to consequences well beyond an awkward conversation with a neighbor. I called Deneen directly the same evening we saw that screenshot, and I want to describe her reaction because it genuinely surprised both Petra and me given how casual she seemed about the entire situation. She explained, without much apparent concern about the fact that we'd learned about this secondhand through a screenshot rather than any actual conversation with her, that she'd simply assumed, based on years of Tyler occasionally swimming with our informal blessing during smaller, specifically invited gatherings, that using the pool for his graduation party would be totally fine. An assumption she'd apparently felt comfortable enough building an entire 40-person event around without ever actually confirming it with either of us. I told Deneen plainly that we had never agreed to host a party of that scale, that we hadn't even been consulted about the date, and that neither Petra nor I had any intention of having our backyard turned into a venue for dozens of teenagers we hadn't personally invited or vetted, a position that, based on Deneen's response, she seemed to find genuinely difficult to accept, arguing that it was too late to change plans now, given that invitations had already gone out and that cancelling would embarrass Tyler in front of his entire friend group. I want to be honest that Petra and I spent a considerable amount of that same evening discussing exactly how to handle a situation that felt, the more we talked through it, less like an innocent miscommunication and more like a deliberate assumption Deneen had apparently decided to simply run with, banking on the idea that we'd feel too socially awkward, this close to the actual event date, to do anything other than reluctantly go along with it, rather than cause a scene that might embarrass a graduating senior in front of dozens of his friends. I sent Deneen a formal written message the following morning, choosing text over another phone call specifically so there would be a clear, documented record of exactly what I said, stating plainly that we had not authorized any party at our property, that we expected her and Tyler to immediately notify every invited guest that the event location needed to change, and that we would consider any gathering at our address without our express permission to constitute trespassing. A word I chose deliberately given how casually she seemed to be treating the actual ownership of the property in question. Deneen's response, which came a full day later, struck both Petra and me as remarkably tone-deaf, given everything we'd already made clear. She suggested, rather than actually cancelling or relocating anything, that perhaps we could simply step out for the afternoon and let Tyler's friends use the backyard without us needing to be directly involved, a proposal that treated our explicit refusal as a minor scheduling inconvenience rather than the clear boundary we'd both already stated it was. I responded within the hour, making clear in writing that under no circumstances would our property be used for this event, invited or otherwise, and that we expected the party plans changed immediately. 4 days passed with no further acknowledgement from Deneen beyond a brief, clipped message noting that the kids have already made their plans, language that told me, more clearly than almost anything else in this entire exchange, that she had no actual intention of doing anything to redirect an event she'd apparently decided was simply going to happen regardless of what Petra and I had already told her twice, in writing, in unambiguous terms. That is the point at which I made the decision that ended up defining this entire story. 2 days before the scheduled party date, I drained our pool completely, a process that took the better part of an afternoon working through our filtration system's standard drainage cycle, and left, in place of a fully filled, ready-to-use pool, an empty concrete basin with a visible, easily photographed sign I posted at the gate explaining, plainly, that the pool was closed for scheduled maintenance and that the property was not authorized for any private event. Party day arrived anyway, exactly as Deneen's messages had suggested it would, and I want to describe what it was like watching, from our own kitchen window, roughly 24 teenagers begin arriving at our property over the course of about 20 minutes, walking around to our backyard gate the same way invited guests would for any legitimate gathering, each one, based on their visible reactions once they actually reached the pool area, discovering the same thing at almost exactly the same moment. An empty, drained concrete basin where a full pool should have been, along with a clearly posted sign explaining that the property wasn't authorized for any private event. Tyler himself showed up not long after, and I watched, again from our kitchen window, a genuinely uncomfortable scene unfold as he tried to explain to his gathering, increasingly confused friend group exactly what had happened, phone calls going out, several kids simply turning around and leaving within minutes of arriving. A small cluster lingering near the empty pool, clearly unsure what to do next given that whatever plan Tyler and Deneen had actually communicated to them apparently hadn't included any contingency for the venue itself being unavailable. Deneen came storming over to our front door within about 15 minutes, and I want to describe that conversation because it was, without question, the most heated exchange either Petra or I had ever had with her across 8 years as neighbors. She accused us directly of deliberately sabotaging her son's graduation celebration out of what she characterized as pure spite, a characterization I responded to by reading back, word for word, the 2 written messages I'd sent her days earlier, explicitly stating that the party was not authorized and that we expected it relocated, messages she had, by her own admission in that same conversation, simply chosen to ignore rather than act on. I want to be honest that Deneen's anger in that moment genuinely didn't move me the way I think she expected it to, mostly because I had, sitting on my own phone, a complete written record showing exactly how clearly and repeatedly we'd communicated our position, and exactly how dismissively she'd responded to every single one of those messages. A record that made her framing of the situation, that we'd somehow ambushed her with an unreasonable, last-minute refusal. Simply impossible to sustain against the actual documented timeline. I also raised, directly and calmly, the alcohol messages we'd seen in that original group chat screenshot, a detail that visibly caught Deneen off guard, given that she hadn't apparently realized we'd seen anything beyond the basic invitation itself, and that shifted the conversation, at least briefly, from her original framing of pure spite toward something closer to a defensive, uncomfortable silence, once she understood exactly how much we actually knew about what had been planned to happen at our own property. Deneen threatened, in that same doorstep conversation, to file a formal complaint with the HOA, an option I told her plainly she was welcome to pursue, given that I had every confidence the HOA's own Architectural and Grievance Committee would review the same written communications I'd just read back to her and reach the obvious conclusion that we had, at every step, acted entirely within our rights as property owners who had explicitly, repeatedly, and in writing, declined to authorize an event on our own private property. She did file that complaint about a week later, and I want to describe the HOA's actual response, because it turned out to be considerably more straightforward than either Deneen or, honestly, even Petra and I had fully expected going in. The Grievance Committee scheduled a formal review meeting, one that both Deneen and I were invited to attend and present our own account of events, and I brought printed copies of every relevant message, time-stamped and organized chronologically, along with the original screenshot documenting the party invitation and its alcohol-related messages, evidence that, once laid out in front of the committee, left remarkably little room for interpretation. Deneen's own presentation to the committee, based on what I observed sitting in that same meeting, leaned heavily on the emotional impact to Tyler rather than any actual dispute of the underlying facts, an approach that, while understandable given how genuinely disappointed her son must have felt, didn't really address the core issue the committee had actually been asked to evaluate, which was simply whether we had the right, as property owners, to refuse an unauthorized event on our own land. A question that had, in Marisler's later description of similar cases she'd handled, essentially one obvious answer regardless of how sympathetic the surrounding circumstances might be. The committee reviewed our full written exchange, the timeline of messages, and Deneen's own admitted acknowledgement that she'd proceeded with party planning despite 2 explicit refusals, and issued a formal written determination within about 3 weeks, finding no basis whatsoever for any action against us, noting plainly in their response that property owners retain full discretion over the use of their own private amenities, and that nothing in the community's governing documents obligated any resident to host an event they had explicitly and repeatedly declined to authorize. I want to be honest that the fallout within the broader neighborhood took a little longer to settle than the formal HOA complaint did. A few neighbors, at least initially, seemed to side with Deneen's framing of the situation, treating the empty pool as an unnecessarily harsh response to what they assumed was simply a well-meaning miscommunication rather than the deliberate, repeatedly ignored refusal it actually was. That perception shifted noticeably, according to what a few more sympathetic neighbors told me directly over the following weeks, once the actual written timeline of events started circulating more broadly through the community. Several residents apparently surprised to learn that Deneen had continued planning the party for 4 full days after receiving 2 explicit, written refusals rather than the more sympathetic version of events she'd initially been sharing around the neighborhood. Our relationship with Deneen and Tyler has remained genuinely distant in the months since, a reality I've made peace with easily enough, particularly given how the entire situation unfolded. Tyler, for what it's worth, ended up having a smaller, considerably less elaborate celebration at a friend's house a few weeks later, an outcome that, however inconvenient the delay might have been for him personally, felt like exactly the kind of resolution that should have happened from the very beginning. Had his mother simply respected our answer the first time we gave it rather than assuming persistence and proximity to the actual event date would eventually force our hand. I think about that screenshot sometimes, the one that first alerted us to an entire party being planned around our property without a single direct request ever actually being made. Deneen Coswell spent 6 weeks convinced that years of casual, informal neighborly goodwill somehow entitled her son to use our pool for a 40-person event she'd never actually asked permission for, right up until the exact moment 24 confused teenagers arrived at an empty concrete basin and discovered, all at once, precisely how mistaken that assumption had been. Thumbnail text: SHE planned a party at my pool. I drained it first.